right, today we are going to cover the first section of chapter 34, and the title of chapter 34 will be An Age of Anxiety. So we'll cover the first section here and leave it off with that. So first, let's just look at the post-war pessimism. What we see is this idea of a lost generation from Gertrude Stein, and she will kind of give this quote to another American writer, Ernest Hemingway. And Stein will give this label to the group of American intellectuals and literates who congregated in Paris in the post-war years, but expressing in the poetry and fiction and the malaise and disillusionment that will characterize the United States and the European thought after the Great War. The vast majority of European intellectuals will rally enthusiastically to the war in 1914 before it actually starts, and we kind of talked about that in chapter 33. But now, when we get to the brutal realities of industrialized warfare, leaving no room for heroes, however, most of these young artists and intellectuals will quickly become disillusioned. We see during the 1920s, we'll see this in a host of war novels, as Hemingway's A Fair Way to Arms in 1929, Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front in 1929, and this work will overflow with images of meaningless death and suffering. So we'll see this idea of pessimism over human progress as well, that we get this Spengler's idea of the decline of the West. Oswald Spengler is in this work, The Decline of the West, in which it's almost like an obituary for civilization, where he will look at this proposal that all societies will pass through a life cycle of growth and decay, similar to biological cycles of living organisms. In his analysis of history, especially of Western Europe, will lead him to conclude that European society had entered its final stage of existence, and all that remained was irreversible decline marked by imperialism and warfare. And his gloomy predictions will provide a kind of comfort for those who sought to rationalize their post-war despair, as did his conviction that all the nations of the world were equally doomed. And so we see this kind of collective cynicism and disillusionment throughout a lot of these authors and painters and people in this lost generation, in these interwar years, because it's reflecting the experiences in which they are going through after this. Now, when we look at new visions in physics, the obvious two faces that we'll put with this especially are going to be Albert Einstein and Werner Heisenberg. Albert Einstein, I think we know from school in general, is going to give the idea of this theory of special relativity, in 1905, showing that there is no single spatial or chronological framework in the universe. And according to his theory, it no longer makes sense to speak of space and time as absolutes, because the measurement of those two categories always varies with the motion of the observer, basically saying space and time are relative to the person that is measuring them. And so we get a kind of different idea of how the observer varies in this observation of space and time, and that there is no real absolute value. And then when we move to Werner Heisenberg and the uncertainty principle, what he will go into is basically say it is impossible to specify simultaneously the position and the velocity of a subatomic particle. The more accurately one determines the position of an electron, the less precisely one can determine its velocity and vice versa. In essence, the scientists cannot observe the behavior of electrons objectively because the act of observation interferes with them. The indeterminacy of the atomic universe demanded that the exact calculations of classical physics be replaced by probable calculations. So it becomes evident that uncertainty principle has important implications beyond physics, because it'll also carry the border of philosophical ramifications. And his theory will call into questions the notions of truth, violating the fundamental law of cause and effect, and objectively, as it is understood, was no longer a valid concept because the observer was always part of the process under observation. So any observer, an anthropologist studying any other society, has to be alert of the fact that his or her very presence becomes an integral part of the study. Just to show you here a picture of probably one of the best known faces of the 20th century, Albert Einstein, who will be a symbol of the revolution in physics. Now, let's look at new visions in psychology, and we'll obviously start with Sigmund Freud in his psychoanalysis. Now, he will begin in 1896 as a medical doctor from Vienna and embark on research that will focus on psychological rather than physiological explanations of mental disorders. Through his clinical observations of patients, Freud is going to identify a conflict between consciousness and subconscious mental processes that lay at the root of neurotic behavior. Now, that conflict will suggest to him the existence of a repressive mechanism that keeps painful memories or threatening events away from the conscious mind. And Freud believed that dreams held a key to the deepest recesses of the human psyche. Using the free associations of patients to guide him in the interpretations of dreams, he identified sexual drives and fantasies as the most important source of repression. From dreams, Freud's going to analyze literature, religion, politics, and virtually every other type of human endeavor, seeking always to identify the manifestations of the repressed consciousness. And he was convinced that his theory, as we alluded to earlier, psychoanalysis, will provide the keys to understanding all human behavior. Now, in the end, Freudian doctrine will help shape the psychiatric profession and establish a powerful presence in literature and the arts. And during the 1920s, novelists, poets, painters will acknowledge Freud's influence as they focused on the inner world or the hidden depths of memory and emotions of their characters. Now, looking at this portrait of Sigmund Freud, you can see him kind of in his element, and again being the father of the psychoanalysis theory. Now, let's move over to experimentation in art. And in this experimentation of art, we're going to see the sense of uncertainty and anxiety will be induced by advances in physics and psychology, also found a reflection in the arts, which in turn contributed to the unsettling atmosphere of the first half of the 20th century. We'll see horror of war as a point of departure. Photography will make realism irrelevant, and art as creation and not a reproduction. We see the birth of Dada or Dadaism that will the origination of it is unclear, but believed to be a deliberately nonsensical word. And between 1960 and 1920, the delusion artists of the Dada movement in Zurich, Paris, and New York used any available public forum to spit metaphorically on nationalism, materialism, and rationalism, which they feel had contributed to a senseless war. They consistently rejected prevailing standards of art and declared an all-out assault on the unquestioned conformity of culture and thought, and they imagined themselves to be artists who created non-art. Also deeply affected by the horrors was a German art movement known as New Objectivity. This genre would be characterized by a realistic style of painting that reflected a very cynical and highly critical attitude towards war. Many proponents of the New Objectivity movement aggressively attacked and satirized the evils of post-war society, especially symbolized by those in political post-war society, especially in parts of Germany and other areas in Europe as well. We see Heinrich Otto Dix being one of the German painters and printmakers notorious for his merciless and bitterly realistic depictions of society in the aftermath of war. He enthusiastically volunteered for the German army in 1914, took part in the Battle of Somme, and then became quickly and profoundly affected and disillusioned by the sights of war. And not all artistic movements drew on experience of the Great War, but by the beginning of the 20th century, the possibilities inherent in a new aesthetic led to the emergence of a bewildering variety of pictorial schools, all of which promise entirely new and unsettling art. And regardless of whether they call themselves Dadaists, Surrealists, Cubists, or Abstractionists, artists generally agreed on a program to abolish the sovereignty of appearance. And paintings no longer depicted recognizable objects from the everyday world, and beauty was expressed in pure color or shape. And so we get this idea that there is this disappearance of distinction between good and bad art. And Pablo Picasso will make his way into this as well. And so we get the changing of how art is perceived and even how art is taught. And like we said earlier, these perceptions are just the realities that these painters are dealing with in conveying their art to the masses, which a lot of these people in these societies after the war are dealing with these same issues and can obviously relate to what's trying to be conveyed in these paintings. Now, let's move to the Great Depression. The problem with the Great Depression, especially the start of this, is going to stem from economic problems, and especially after World War I, when we have this really bungled, entangled financial system that will involve war debts among the Allies, reparations paid by Germany and Austria, and the flow of U.S. funds to Europe. And basically, the money borrowed from the United States by Austria and Germany to pay war debts to France, or reparations to France and England, will then be used by France and England, being dependent on those payments to pay the debts owed to the United States for World War I. So it was like the United States was just getting its money back. The problem is the system was dependent on flow of cash from the United States. And what we start to see in 1928, as people start to pull out, the investors start to pull out in 1928, this creates uncertainty and creates fear that debts won't get paid, loans won't get paid. And so the money kind of restricts in that sense. And that's going to kind of set the Great Depression in motion. Now, this picture shows soup kitchens and bread lines that will become commonplace in the United States during the earliest, darkest years of the Great Depression, but they will feed millions of starving and unemployed people as they are going through those lines. We also see pictured here in January of 1932, tens of thousands of hunger strikers marching on Washington, D.C., looking for government relief for the misery that they're in the Great Depression. But also there's some other factors that go into this. We have new technologies and the Great Depression that will go into this. So we see improvements in industrial processes, reducing worldwide demand for certain raw materials. This will cause an increase in supplies and a drop in prices. Technological advances in the production of automobile tires, for instance, permitted the use of reclaimed rubber. So you're not using all of the natural resources that you used to keep up with the rubber supply. So the resulting glut of natural rubber had devastating consequences for economies like the Dutch East Indies, Ceylon, and Malaysia, which are going to rely heavily on this export of rubber. Similarly, the increased use of oil undermined the coal industry, and the emergence of synthetics will hurt the cotton industry, and the growing adoption of artificial nitrogen will basically ruin the nitrate industry of Chile. And so we see a lot of new technologies, new processes, just of reclaiming certain natural resources that you don't need them like you did prior. So you're scaling back on the exports that these countries were very heavily reliant on. All right. Now, let's look at agricultural surpluses of the Great Depression, because we're going to have agricultural surpluses that we haven't seen for 400 years, especially when you look at the price of a bushel of wheat. Once we get the economics passed, well, now we got to look at agriculture, and the result of overproduction is going to cause even more falling prices here. So we'll talk about how that will be affected. So we get overproduction in the 1920s, and some of the strongest harvests we'll see in 1925 and 1929. And like we said, a bushel of wheat at the lowest price in 400 years. The problem is that farm incomes drops, meaning less demand for manufactured goods, and then we ultimately have inventory surpluses. So we see that farmers in the United States, Canada, Argentina, and Australia try to expand their production, and at the end of the war, European farmers resumed agricultural activity and contributing to worldwide surpluses above average global harvests, like we talked about in 1925 and 1929. And then the production increased and demand declined, price collapsed throughout the world. By 1929, like we said, the bushel of wheat was at its lowest level in 400 years, and all these farmers all over the place are going to become impoverished. And the reduction of income of these farm families contributes to the high inventories of manufactured goods, which in turn causes businesses to cut back production and to dismiss workers. So you can see this is all kind of connected one way or another, and as the domino falls, kind of like we talked about with the start of World War I, as these things become more and more connected, we see that they are affected as one falls and the other one falls and the other one falls. And so that connectivity is what really gets this thing going. Now, when we look at the crash of 1929, the United States in the roaring 20s will enjoy a boom after the Great War. We'll see industrial wages were high, production and consumption will increase, and many people in the U.S. will invest their earnings and savings in speculative ventures, and particularly buying stock on margin, putting up as little as 3% of a stock's price in cash and borrowing the remainder from brokers and banks or by mortgaging their homes. This is going to create a little bit of a bubble. By October of 1929, we get hints of a worldwide economic slowdown and warnings from experts that stock prices were overvalued, prompting investors to pull out of the market because of uncertainty, but also the variables that we talked about as well. So we get 3%. We get hints of slowdown in Europe, and investors begin to sell. And just like what we alluded to earlier, this becomes a snowball effect. And what we'll see is on Black Thursday, October 24th, a wave of panic selling on the New York Stock Exchange caused stock prices to plummet. We kind of saw this with what's going on now with the coronavirus in the market that's going on right now. Investors who had overextended themselves in a frenzy of speculative stock purchases watched in agony because they were spread too thin already. Thousands of people, from poor widows to industrial tycoons, will lose their life savings, and by the end of the day, 11 financiers had committed suicide. Is how how it shows you the magnitude of this. And the crisis deepened when lenders called in loans saying, "Give me my money back," and thereby forcing investors to sell their securities to pay back those loans. We haven't seen anything like this except for the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, when the housing bubble collapsed, and there was financial insecurities there as well. So kind of similar in that regard. Now, let's finish up with the economic contraction that spreads. We see inventory surpluses will lead to layoffs, and the issue is just selling goods. So in the wake of this financial chaos, we'll have a drastic decrease in business activity, wages, and employment. Consumer demand will no longer suffice to purchase all the goods that businesses produced. And when businesses realized that they cannot sell their inventories, they responded with cutbacks because they needed the money. So they cut back in production and also additional layoffs. And with so many people unemployed or underemployed, demand plummeted for further because they don't have money to pay for these products, and causing more business failures and soaring unemployment. In 1930, the slump deepened, and by 32, industrial production had fallen to half of its 1929 level. National income had dropped by approximately half. 44% of U.S. banks were out of business, and the deposits of millions of people had disappeared because of much of the world's prosperity depended on the export of U.S. capital and those loans that we talked about. In the strength of U.S. import markets, the contraction of the U.S. economy created this ripple effect that will circle the globe because the reliance is on the United States at this time, or at least a big portion of it, especially when you're talking about those loans and reparations as well. So we see that 44% of U.S. banks, like we said, out of business, and deposits will be lost. Most societies will experience economic difficulties throughout the 1930s. Although the severity of the economic contraction varied in intensity, virtually every industrialized society saw its economy shrivel. You see inflation start to creep in, and again, people out of work, not able to get food. This is kind of the sentiments that we're looking at now, where we're looking at lockdowns around the states because of coronavirus and how we're going to get food and keeping these essential services open, which they didn't really have that back then, but that wasn't created by a virus. This is more of just economic speculation, investors pulling their money out, and a couple of the variables that we talked about earlier. So we see nations trying to rely on exports of manufactured goods to pay for imported fuel and food. Germany and Japan in particular suffered the most. The Depression also spread unevenly to primary producing economies in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Hardest hit were countries that depended on the export of a few primary products, agricultural goods such as coffee, sugar, and cotton, and raw materials such as minerals, ores, and rubber. Now, that's where we'll stop with section 1 today. We'll pick this back up. We'll talk about world economic collapse, despair in government action, economic experimentation, and then continue on from there with section 2. All right, take care. We'll see you all later.